So, breaking news for everybody that is currently watching this right now or watching this in the near future, going on the live stream. Nick Diaz is back for UFC Abu Dhabi in the same card that Umar Nurmagomedov is going to headline versus Corey Sandhagen. Now, who is Nick Diaz's opponent? We will reveal that in just a short second, if you don't already know. Who else is in this card that's also being exploited? Tony Ferguson taking on Michael Chiesa. And why? 7 losses in a row, and Tony Ferguson is back at it again. Unfortunately, this same goes for Nick Diaz, because guess who he's fighting? Vicente Luque. And you got to ask yourself, is this a very exploitive matchup, considering that Nick Diaz's last win was 13 years ago against BJ Penn? And then you got to look at and ask yourself, where's BJ Penn at right now? That was literally his last win. And in 21, he didn't look very good. He didn't look very good against Robbie Lawler. But also considering how Robbie Lawler looked really good on his way out. Again, not indicative of anything, considering that we are trying to compare Nick Diaz and where he's at in his career. And now he's going to take on Vicente Luque, the guy who is considered to be one of the most violent men in all of MMA. And that's who Nick Diaz is going to fight. And it's going to be a 5-round fight. It's not going to be in a co-main event or a main event scenario. It's going to be a featured bout. Somewhere maybe in the 5th fight, or I'm sorry, maybe even the 3rd to the last fight. Right? So just right before the co-main event as a feature. And then the rest, yes, it is Corey Sandhagen, Umar Nurmagomedov, and a whole bunch of other fights that are going to be involved in the card as well. Those are the 3 that I have off top of my head right now as we discuss why Nick Diaz is going to be the guy to take on Vicente Luque for his return. A bit exploitive, to be quite honest with you. And reason being is because either the UFC was asked by the host to have a big name like this, or it was Nick Diaz's request. And then the other conversation of that really falls into the mindset of fighters and when to quit. I don't think Nick Diaz has any quit in him, but unfortunately, I think that's going to be his downfall. And I'm not talking about his fighting career, because that's already passed and understood that he is way beyond his prime. Which means that his quality of life is going to be compromised. All because of the fact that he does not want to quit. He wants to prove to the world that he's still a tough guy. You look at somebody like GSP, right? This guy is somebody who, by the way, was Nick Diaz's last welterweight fight. Let's put that into perspective, because this fight is going to be held at welterweight. You guys understand that, right? So being that this fight is at welterweight, Nick Diaz has to cut a lot more weight than what he previously had to in his days when he was fighting George St. Pierre and Carlos Condit. So as a result, it's going to be a tough camp. It's going to be a camp where he has to focus a lot on weight cutting, which means that I guess it's not anything that he isn't used to, because Nick and Nate, they're both triathletes. And for those of you that don't know what a triathlete triathlon is, put it like this, it's a race that involves swimming, running, and biking. So I believe the race starts out with a swim, and then perhaps maybe 20 some odd miles on the bike. And then after the bike, then you do a 7-mile run. And then there's other triathlons that are even more extreme than that by numbers. So the perspective that I'm trying to paint to you is that Nick Diaz has and always will be a guy who is in phenomenal shape in terms of cardio. But one has to ask, has he been doing something like this? Has he been training in this particular matter? And to be quite honest with you, when I look at his current body frame and the frame that he had during the Robbie Lawler fight, which was literally only 2-3 years ago, it didn't look like he was doing any triathlons. And usually you could tell. So now you got to ask yourself, how ready is Nick Diaz for this fight? And I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think he's ready at all. I think this fight is going to end devastatingly for Nick Diaz. And there's no other way to put it. Look, I got to be honest with you guys. When you have a mixed martial arts page or do MMA content, you have to be very objective. You can't disparage another fighter. But when you have the track record that Nick Diaz has, you can't help but be very disparaging to the future results of what can happen here. Which means that you got to ask the question, is the UFC being exploitive, or is it the demand of the host of the country that requires a big name like this? And you can't help but feel skeptical that that is the particular case. Because then you ask yourself, if it's not about competitive architecture, then why do you need Nick Diaz? Considering that he hasn't won in 13 years, hasn't fought at 170 since his George St. Pierre fight. And let me put in perspective when that George St. Pierre fight was. UFC 158. And where are we at right now? This weekend is going to be UFC 302, and then Conor McGregor's and Michael Chandler's fight is going to be UFC 303. 158. 158, and we are at 302. Plus more fight nights just like this one that is going to be featured in Abu Dhabi with Umar Nurmagomedov and Corey Sandhagen as a headline. And this is going to take place in October. Another fun fact about this fight, Nick Diaz is going to be 41 years old. The day before the fight, which is the weigh-in, is going to be his birthday. I want you to put that in real, okay? Nick Diaz is going to be 41 years old. And understand this, everybody ages differently. Yoel Romero was competing in his 40s, looked very competitive at 40 some odd years old. Randy Couture, the same thing. What do they have in common? The fact that they are wrestlers? Yes. There's a certain work ethic that involves being a wrestler, the grind, the constant anaerobic pace that you have to push. Whereas with Nick Diaz, not to disparage anybody that does triathlons, but let me put it like this. If he's asking for a 5-round fight, then it shows that Nick Diaz, for sure, is doing some triathlon workouts in order for him to get ready for a 5-round fight. He's the one that requested this. Do you think it's Vicente Luque that would want a 5-round fight? Do you think that it's the Emiratis that would want a 5-round fight? Do you think it's the UFC staff that wants the 5-round fight? Nick Diaz has said plenty of times before that I'm the type of fighter that will fight to the death. And what does he mean by that? What he means by that is that he can fight at a no-limit time rule set. In other words, he'll drag you into a fight where eventually you're going to have to cave in and give up. And that's where Nick Diaz is at with his fighting career in terms of the days in his prime. But all of that is gone. What we got right now is Nick Diaz as a shell of his old self. But what he is, and what he will always will be, is a tough guy. And unfortunately, you got to understand something. This is the most disparaging thing I'm ever going to say. Tough guys don't live long. And this is what we're going to witness with Nick Diaz. The fall of a tough guy. What fall am I talking about? Am I talking about the absolute ultimate end to your life? Perhaps. Am I talking about the absolute end to having strong cognitive functions and compromising your quality of life in your later stages? Yes. That is the possibility that is going to happen with this particular fight. Because not only has Nick Diaz been in a lot of car crashes in his entire fight career, but he is now dealing with a man that specializes in car crashes, which is Vicente Luque. And that is the dangerous part about this matchup. It's dangerous stylistically. It's dangerous for the fact that Nick Diaz has taken an accumulative amount of damage over the years. And here's another thing I need you to understand. When Nick Diaz was fighting in his prime, I was training with Dustin Akbari. He is the head grappling coach of Team Alpha Male. And he has fought Nate Diaz in a grappling match. There's actually a video out there of Dustin Akbari grappling Nate Diaz in a tournament. And he told me, obviously, he's known these guys for a long time. Ever since that grappling match, they've had exchanges. They've had training sessions together. Nick and Nate have came out here in Sacramento plenty of times. So as a result, what you have was a friendship between Dustin Akbari and Nick and Nate Diaz. So he knows them. And why I'm telling you this is because in the lead up to the George St. Pierre fight, I saw Dustin Akbari at a college, same college that me and him had gone to at the time, right? And when I saw him, I asked him, hey, who do you go for in the Nick Diaz versus George St. Pierre fight this weekend? He told me, Dustin Akbari said, I'm going to go for George St. Pierre. I think Nick Diaz is punch drunk. And keep in mind, this was in 2013 when this fight had happened. So you need to keep that in perspective. 2013. A guy who has trained, competed against the Diaz brothers are already noticing signs of CTE. And then years later, it doesn't help with the inactivity and in the accumulative damage that they took over their careers. And now here we are. And ironically, on the same card as where Tony Ferguson and, who is he fighting? Michael Chiesa. Not the most devastating fight for Tony Ferguson, to be quite honest with you, because let's be honest, Michael Chiesa is not the biggest knockout artist. He's not going to hurt you in a way that Deontay Wilder could hurt you. But it's going to be a grappling affair between those two. And when it comes to Umar Nurmagomedov and Corey Sandhagen, obviously the way that I see that is Umar Nurmagomedov is going to be too well-rounded. He's going to bounce around on his feet. A lot of people are going to be surprised of how he's going to outbox Corey Sandhagen. Corey Sandhagen, I think, is very dangerous on the feet, has certain attributes to where he can throw head kicks. He can be very devastating at his range. However, I believe that as far as it goes, Omar Nurmagomedov is the much more well-rounded athlete. And as a result of that, I believe that being the more well-rounded fighter, it's going to lend himself into better opportunities and better openings in every exchanges of the fight. With Tony Ferguson and Michael Chiesa, it's going to be a grappling fest, which I think is going to favor Michael Chiesa. I could see a scenario where he doesn't finish him, he just grinds him out. But I could also see a scenario where Michael Chiesa would show a little bit of mercy towards him. Now, with Tony Ferguson and Nick Diaz, the featured fight of this card, and what may some people perceive as the people's main event, but in reality, more like the most exploitive matchup in UFC history. He's going to get knocked out. And I think that we rarely see Nick Diaz get knocked out, if ever. I think this time around, you're really going to see it. But only time will tell. Inshallah. That's really all that I have for this particular set of event, with Nick Diaz now signed to fight Luque Vicente in UFC Abu Dhabi, a fight night in October. Like and subscribe. And what's great about this is now the fight nights are finally back on the road. And I think I'm going to make a video about that. How fight nights are back on the road and no longer in the Apex, and the impact of the Apex as opposed to being on the road. Well, inshallah, that is all that I have. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Or you know what? What I'll do is I'll go on for another 3 minutes just to make it a solid 20 minutes, okay? I'll go on for another 20 minutes, another 3 minutes to make it 20 minutes, and really tell you why this particular fight is exploitive, but also why it's good for the bottom dollar of the UFC. So it's obvious, a fight like this is very much exploitive to the athlete in Nick Diaz. He doesn't have the proper ranking. Not only that, I don't think he deserves to be in this particular spotlight with Vicente Luque. Because there are reasons why there are rankings for a reason. And he hasn't won in 13 years, hasn't made 170 since his George St. Pierre fight. And these are the circumstances that he's going to be in. Being that he's a former title contender, a former Strikeforce champion, and lost the interim title, arguably, a lot of people thought he won against Carlos Condit. Still, it's not fair in the modern rankings of exactly where Vicente Luque is at right now. So none of this is fair. Not the physical attributes that he lacks to be in this fight, and certainly not the rankings and the competitive integrity and architecture of the UFC. But I got to tell you, unfortunately, as I close out this live stream, this is going to be good for the Emiratis, for the UFC, for their partnership, because they brought in big names for a fight night in which there are a lot of pay-per-view fights out there that they are going to put on for the year. But this right here is the backbone of the UFC's catalog. And they're adding on a fight night, going away from the Apex pandemic era of fighting in that particular venue, and expanding back into the road just the way they did a few years ago. So guys, once again, that is all that I have for the Nick Diaz story of coming back to UFC Abu Dhabi. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I will see you on the next content, inshallah. Great stream, brother Chad Johnson. Thank you, Chad Johnson. And don't forget to like and subscribe, everybody. I will see you guys in the end and for the next content. And not only that, watch from beginning to end. because I drop some gems and some real good information that I think, as a mixed martial arts observer, you will appreciate.